Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. We are very excited to have you here. My name is Jonathan Matthews. I'm the VP of Publisher Development for the Americas, joined with an amazing panel that I'm going to allow to introduce themselves shortly. While I'm happy to do it, I feel like they would do a much better job than I would. But before we do so, I wanted to quickly specify that we did have a more diverse panel initially. Unfortunately, a few folks had to back out at the last minute. If you happen to be watching, obviously we love you and we hope that you join us again in a future panel. But today we still have an amazing panel, and we thank everyone for coming to watch, for being a part of this, and obviously for all of you for being here today. Before passing it over for introductions, just to kick it off, today we're here to talk about the ad tech tax and how advertisers and publishers can join forces with active curation. So I personally am interested to learn how our panelists define the ad tech tax, but from Ogilvy's perspective, right, we found that advertisers and publishers are rapidly rationalizing and optimizing media spend and removing intermediaries and middlemen to mitigate the rising ad tech tax, right? And there's a lot involved in that, and obviously that was a pretty big statement to digest. But with that being said, without further ado, let me sort of pass it over to introductions. And if you wouldn't mind, when you introduce yourself, if you could then follow it up by just defining how you view ad tech tax or how it relates to you, I think that would be very helpful for everybody, and we can go from there. So thank you. I guess, Mike, if you want to start.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. My name is Mike Brooks. I'm the SVP of Revenue at WeatherBug and Marketing, Revenue and Marketing as of earlier this year. WeatherBug is a US-based omni-channel weather media property serving 15 million Americans every month. My role is kind of twofold. I'm on the revenue side, so the making of the money, the monetization, but also on the marketing and user acquisition side. So even though we're newer to marketing than some of our friends up here, having insight into both of those things is very interesting. When I think about the ad tech tax, like I'm on both sides of it, right? I'm the publisher receiving that money, and we don't want too much of it going, but I want to make sure my impression gets where it wants to go as a buyer. So I kind of think about it like an envelope and stamps, right? You want to send the right amount of stamps, but at some point it's too many and you're just wasting money. So what is the right amount of money that has to go in your buy, not to a publisher, to get it where you want it, the way you want it, while minimizing that waste and like sending that envelope efficiently? I think that's kind of how we think about it.
Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex Payne. I'm VP of Ad Operations at Vice Media Group, youth media publisher, mostly online, but also offline. My view on ad tax, I suppose I have a preferred view of ad tax, how I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it as beneficial to both the supply and the demand side. Understandable, justifiable. However, I do feel like perhaps it's not meeting all of those requirements and can be somewhat perhaps duplicative and prey on anxieties that are in the market but are perhaps being capitalized on a little too much.
Thank you, Alex.
Hi, my name is Oleg Kornfeld. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of CMI Media Group. We are part of the WPP family. We are specifically in the health and wellness vertical. I see ad tech tax here today as, I guess, something that pays for all these yachts. And secondly, to me, it's basically what is a buyer willing to spend, and is it enough of what publisher gets to see in the end by the time all the fees are taken out? And is that incentive enough for them to give me the impression I was willing to buy in the first place? So that gap between what I was willing to pay and what the publisher finally got is the tech tax.
Thank you. I feel like there was a lot of a common theme to some degree between what each of you said, and sort of to comment on, three different items, I suppose, right? Mike, you talked about, and I think you mentioned it, waste, and you mentioned waste multiple times, right? And then Alex, you talked about justification, and then you made the joke that this pays for the yachts at Cannes. But question here being, so when you think of the ad tech tax, are you then naturally viewing it as wasteful, or are you just saying there's just too much waste or loss in the system today?
Inherently, I think the word tax maybe has a negative connotation by itself, but it's not. There's a value to it, right? We all pay taxes for our roads. to be
roads,
fixed,
man.
depending where you live. So there's absolute necessity for technologies to be between the buyer and the seller to provide efficiencies. But because we know that ad tech stack has been severely overbuilt, and a lot of the platforms that we end up using with do not talk to one another, that fragmentation is that waste that I think we all are talking about, and that's the unnecessary tax in this calculation.
It's something as a being newer to media buying, it's been tougher for us to have transparency into those things. So I think we'll probably talk about some of these things later on. But for us, it's a newer idea that we're trying to strive for. That we're starting, I think, kind of further away from a transparent world and trying to work our way closer, like some of our peers here.
And I would say that perhaps the tax itself has been a little fixated on the technology and has led to over-engineering of solutions and duplicative solutions. And we've neglected the human side of the ad tech tax, right? The human relationships, the publisher development, the brands to publisher relationship, that an ad tech tax through a partner can actually be very worthwhile.
And I appreciate that. I also like that you threw in my title in there, but no, it's a totally joke. But I mean, I think it's interesting, right? From my perspective, when I speak to publishers on a regular basis, and I don't work very much on the demand side, but I support our initiatives on the demand side. The redundancy that you're referring to, or the duplicative nature of this industry, comes up a lot, right? And so, we've all spoke before, and you understand that at Ogre, we try to be the middleman between advertisers and publishers, but a singular middleman, opposed to there being multiple chains or links or roads, as we called it before, right? But I would like to know from your perspective, what are areas that you find to be duplicative, and what do you think sort of the industry needs to cut back on a bit?
Something I would say looking forward is I'm worried a little bit about identity and the role that identity has on the tech tax. It's the kind of thing where everyone is going to sell you something that we need, but it's kind of something that's been baked in up to this point. So in the future, what is the role of identity there? That's one that's kind of a question for us, and I feel like could get very murky quickly, kind of especially in the context of what's necessary and what's not.
I mean, that's probably the most important one. But because you already took it, I'll do. I know. I'll do brand safety. I'm not sure I understand why both sides of the coin need to pay, and often pay the same companies, to validate the same impression. To me, again, those guys have really big yachts out there. So I'm wondering maybe that's the reason.
And the other aspect of quality inventory as well. I mean, we consider brand safety or brand suitability as part of a quality impression, but also viewability. Multiple vendors out there measuring the same space with the same technology, and there's a tax on both publisher and advertiser side, and I feel there needs to be a trust in the solution, perhaps deployed by the publisher, always on, trust that number, trust that relationship. Let's provide the reporting from one place, not compare and contrast ultimately two of the same solution.
Sure. Would you want to add something, Oleg?
No, it's not necessarily who is responsible for this. It's what do we do about it. I think that's more important. And from the buy side, what we've often haven't done is try to understand what is the stack that the publisher side is using. We're fixated on the technologies that are facing us, and part of it is that over-engineering of the overall ad tech that is between the buyer and the seller, and we tend to focus only on the tools that were built to support our initiatives, understanding that there's a completely different set of technologies supporting the supply side, and how they interact with one another, I think will help us bridge that and get closer. Because in the end, it is the curation of the supply. We need these platforms to help us organize it in the best way possible, but we need to be as close as possible to the publisher and understand what are those tools in between. Like if we know each tool, we can then make a judgment whether it needs to be in the chain or not.
And just to add, you spoke about identity. I think what can be lost through scrutinizing technology and this this tax that is enforced is the identity of the publisher, whose audience it is that you, to begin with, were going after. You found it resonated with your own brand and with your own audience, and that's the true identity that we shouldn't lose sight of through our advertising, online or offline.
I feel like I have so much to sort of add, like to ask about these different points. But before I do so, Mike, was there anything you wanted to add to that at all?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so perfectly fine. So so then through the theme of what you mentioned, Mike, you were talking about there being sort of validation and targeting and that sort of data, and then we talked about there being brand safety, and then trust came up in the discussion, right? Do you agree, or do you feel that this all leads to a very rudimentary definition of trust and distrust, right? So do you trust and distrust the supply paths, the audiences, the technology you work with? Like, has that led to this fragmentation, and would it be cleared up if there was maybe, I don't know, more of a set defined area for this or rules for this?
That's the frustrating part of it, because it's supposed to be automated. Because it's technology, because it's automated, some people will take opportunities of misunderstandings to create unnecessary tolls along the way. So we tend to actually go back to manual process by creating these very specific private marketplaces. Sometimes it's almost like it's supposed to be automated, but we still need that trust to be built first before we create a very manual private marketplace, so we can activate it automatically.
I mean, can you automate? I mean, the answer to this is yes. You can automate trust, but I feel like, can you automate trust until there is sort of an industry standard for all these items we're talking about, or is the fact that, not to call out companies specifically, but verification companies or validation companies, right? They each define what's a real impression versus not a real impression differently. So would that need to be streamlined or an industry standard set up before you could set up automated trust like that?
I feel like big buyers can kind of set the market to a certain extent, like some have, especially in the viewability world, as of late. I think one of the challenges with trust is like, where does that autonomy sit? Is it like the IAB? Is it a Google? Is it a like an IAS, like a human? But Google may have has their hands in so much stuff, right? Like, how do we make it most sustainable by understanding where it sits? And part of it's collective, but yeah, I agree, it's not Google.
I'm not going to add a comment to that. But Alex, was there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I think we should decide whether we want to trust digital media as an advertising platform, because I certainly do, but it feels at times like we don't. We're looking for a reason not to trust it. We're looking for an erroneous impression or a invalid user, I think trust needs to be more intrinsic for it to really succeed as a medium.
But I think there's also a technological angle to it. There's no one way things are done. And I think a lot of these companies that help us, lean into trust, take different approaches, and I cannot, you cannot take this technological path versus the other one, because they often address potentially different parts of the problem. So standardizing that, I'm not sure what that will do to innovation.
Yeah, and I think buying teams need flexibility to some point too. As long as it's the same mechanics that are going into it, you can find standardization without making everybody saying it's 3 seconds, 50%, et cetera.
So again, keeping on this subject of trust and mistrust, right? Or distrust. I think a lot of what we've heard, or what I've heard speaking to publishers in general throughout this festival, is that they believe that to some degree the industry is overcomplicating things, right? That you could say that distrust or started with major companies, potentially bigger organizations, and didn't take into consideration the impact it might have on smaller publishers or organizations in the space. And now you have sort of this war starting between Google and the Trade Desk, right? And so What I would be curious to know is do you agree with this, or do you think it stemmed from something entirely different?
I think a lot of it stemmed from lack of education on the buy side. And as a representative of the buy side, I think I'm willing to admit that. But it's also fair to understand that that's not how the buy side was raised. It didn't. If the qualifications were you first have to spend 3 years working for a technology company before you start buying, I think it would be slightly different there. But taking advantage of the fact that there's this gap in education sometimes creates that.
I think one of the challenges is like, how do you control for bad actors? Like early on in the trust game, it was, DSPs doing tons of view-through conversions on below-the-fold inventory, right? I think about in the mobile app install space, like click injection and how instances like fraud have come out there. But it's like, it's big money fast. So it's people who recognize a way to exploit the system, make a lot of money really fast. I would say get out, but they can still do it. How do you stop that? How do you react to bad actors? Because to me, when I think about media buying and some of the reasons I'm reluctant in digital, even though we buy in digital, are reasons that stick in my maw like that.
I tend to think about it as kind of like installing antivirus software, right, on your computers, and their job is to kind of catch up with the latest and greatest hackers and how they're building their malware. And unfortunately, it ends up being basically somewhat of cost of doing business, knowing that percentage of media that we're spending will always end up in the wrong place.
And it's quite curious because obviously there's a feeling, I guess, of a lack of control, particularly with the big tech partners, the massive scale, the massive audiences that are accessible, the controls that are available. But by having so many, it almost feels like it could go out of control at any moment, right? If you're not pulling the right levers or applying the right settings. And we feel as obviously a content creator, we've always got that advantage over big tech because we're the ones creating content. They're not. We understand that better than they could ever.
I mean, you have control over the content, like you said, the messaging, sort of what you put out there to the audiences you appeal to. But do you not feel to some degree beholden to their technology? I mean, I'm not trying to call out Google here, but let's just say, GAM or Chrome or everything like that. Does that in any way restrict how you would like to do business? Or no, you still feel like you're autonomous and you can do as you feel there?
I feel in control of my own inventory, of my own audience, with the help of big technology. I just don't feel like the buy side is necessarily.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Their access,
Sure.
that they're actually getting the quality that we know we have. I don't know if they know that they are necessarily.
Okay.
So WeatherBug has gone through a ton of work to not be a Google ad serving shop. And it takes a lot to understand. We have a whole team focused on this, and we're of the size that we can support, in the team. But we pay a cost for that. Like, we pay a cost for that flexibility, but the way that we do the math is we can monetize better with the whole world than with the controlled box that Google gives us. Sure. So, it pushes us even further away from the buy side, though, because they're even further away from what we're doing. But that's one of the things that we have actively done and put work into, and so far it's paid dividends. But it has not been easy.
Kind of full circle goes back to my initial statement about we're willing to pay a certain amount. We know a publisher sees a fraction of what we were willing to pay in the first place. I'm wondering what they would have given me as far as quality of supply if they've seen a bigger percentage of what I knew I was willing to pay in the first place.
Yeah, right.
And when that connection is owned, the rails, the train, the electricity that feeds the train is all owned by the same company,
Yeah, the buying value of your impression is decreased in a unified auction world, right? Because if your competitors are taking less or having less tax taken, their bid is going to win in the WeatherBug auction. and they're going to get the impression.
Yeah, and this is actually very interesting to me, and I appreciate it. So to be very clear, in no way, shape, or form am I trying to knock at Google in any way. It's just that being in this space for 15 years now, and I mean, Mike, you might say go ahead and do it, but being in this
3 or 4 times. So
yeah,
we have it on tape.
Yeah, that's true. But being in the space for 15 years, I feel like when I speak to publishers regularly, it's what they talk to me. So like my position, both at Ogre and in general, is to understand what publishers are experiencing in the space, where are their constraints, where do they need help. And a lot of time I hear them talk to me about ad tech tax as it relates to Google and the cost, almost feeling like they have to. And that's exactly why I asked that question. Yeah.
I mean, look, they are the 800-pound, or however that is in kilos, gorilla in a room, because when it comes to the ad server that we tend to use on the buy side, probably the same company is managing the ad server on the sell side. The exchange in the middle. It's just they are available every step of the way, and because of how much of the industry they control, it's just natural. It makes sense.
Yeah, and I appreciate your perspective there too. Like as somebody who's not necessarily buy side or demand side facing, right? This is very interesting for me. So I mean, moving away then from the subject of Google, which we got to from trust, right? I do think going back to specifically to ad techs though, the ad tech tax, excuse me, right? There's a part of it that applies to all of this, which is of course the deprecation of cookies, right? And so when it comes to first-party data or thereafter, right? How is this impacting you, or how are you approaching a sort of cookieless world right now? And we can start with you, Mike, if you want. Yeah.
So we've at Weatherbug have kind of had to take it earlier than most people because we're so focused on app. So we have half of our business being iOS app. That means that we've faced like cookie-ish challenges maybe 2 years ahead. We've seen the monetization issues. There's big things we're doing like focusing on direct sales. There's a lot of really interesting technology in mobile app that's being developed right now to maybe answer for these that we're just in like the first or second inning on. But for us, like building first-party data, the question comes up is like, how do you ensure trust between the buyer and us, right? Like if we're telling somebody this is a seller-defined audience, how do they know that what we're saying is true? There's still that level of, we still have to be able to prove it somehow, and I think that's one of the missing keys in the future of first-party data as applied to cookies, is like, how is Oleg going to trust that like the data that every publisher makes for him is exactly what they say? I don't know. That's either, maybe that's a tech tax to be had that needs to be created, or like some kind of service there. But
I think that's what clean rooms are trying to provide, and that's the new tech tax to validate that. My concern is, well, on one hand, because we're in this unique kind of health vertical, and we have two types of consumers, right? We have the physicians and we have the patients. The physicians, actually, this problem does not even concern that side of the industry. It's amazing how the technology that has been built to take physician identities and target them in digital environments is fairly established, very first-party cookie-driven already, and that's how it's always been. And that we're not worried about that one. As we expand to the consumer side, and now we want to talk to the patients, now we're in a normal kind of advertising world, and this is where I'm looking at all the options that are coming up right now and basically trying to figure out, okay, we're going back to fragmentation, right? We just spent all these years deduplicating the third-party cookie across multiple activation channels. Now we're going back to silos, and everybody has their own approach. We don't know which one is going to be the most scalable or the most trustworthy once we end it, but we will be trying to dig into the origination, how they're going to be building that, and then how well we'll be able to scale it. Because if we're going to end up with a couple impressions per option, operational overhead to manage all of it seems really, really complex.
I would just add that at Vice, we've welcomed the shift. We've lent into contextual advertising for several years now. We're an early adopter of brand safety for obvious reasons. And we consider contextual targeting, and have done, as a live audience, a form of live audience. And when we speak about trust, we There's trust in understanding what that user is doing at that time across our properties. We can measure it, we can store it, and we can target it. So in a world of where Vice was relying on third-party data for demographics, personally, I didn't trust that. You know, you're kind of needing to trust how it was defined, but it wasn't defined by your hands, right? Or by your team. When you're dealing with contextual, it very much is.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree we're seeing almost like a rebirth of contextual, right? It's not that it ever went anywhere, but people are focusing on it more in this, post-cookie world that's coming up. Alex, for you, you mentioned you're using contextual already. Are you deploying any other tools or strategies to define your audience or break it into segments? Like is memberships part of the equation now? Like we've seen a lot of publishers enter again, or what are you sort of applying?
We've done work in that space. Waypoint Plus is a fantastic example of a subscription version of our Waypoint, our gaming channel. Growing an audience there. We have a dedicated newsletter following across particularly Refinery 29. But we're never going to compete with a Google or a Facebook in the identity space through demographics and their login data, because we don't have a login system. We have ways in which we can define the user through a subscription, as you mentioned, but single login, no.
And how about you, Mike? Sorry, he needs a mic.
So for us in the subscription world, we have some work to do on the product side, but I think we have been an ad-supported business for forever, and moving to subscription, we have some challenges as a business thinking about our mission as a brand is to keep people safe and aware, but like only if it's behind a paywall. Like $2, you have to pay $2 to know if a tornado is going to wreck your house, to use Eddie's analogy from earlier. We struggle with like a little bit of like the mission alignment and what we can provide. So with that, we have to do a lot of extra product work to build a lot of new things. But we've only built ad product historically. We haven't had subscription products. So looking at how we're deploying our resources and understanding what percentage of our revenue could this be, and is the way that we're investing in it reflected in what we're doing?
I think there's always going to be this hierarchy of accuracy. The more accurate you get, the smaller pool of audience you'll have, but that doesn't mean that's the only pool of audiences that will drive ROI for you. Because I assume at the lower level, kind of sliding scale of accuracy, or however you want to look at it, the cost will be less. So the back-end numbers should be justifiable. So it's not one and all.
So that was actually going to ask you this. So from your perspective, you mentioned consumers. Obviously, the deprecation of cookies makes it a bit more complicated. So, Oleg, are there other tools, or like how are you measuring the effectiveness of your campaigns in a post-cookie world? Is it just engagement? Like how are you doing this currently, or planning on doing this?
Well, first of all, we're not in a post-cookie world yet.
Yeah, true.
Everything we're doing as an industry is still very much is third-party cookie based. So it's hard for me to say here's exactly how we do that scale. I can speak to what we do on a healthcare professional side, on a targeting doctor side, where it's always been more first-party data cookie based. The analysis is very straightforward because it's direct to publishers. We can compare notes fairly accurately.
Yeah, I mean, from an Ogre perspective, right? I agree. We cookies haven't gone anywhere, and we still utilize cookies as we can. But we've been preparing for the cookieless world for quite some time, right? And so what we've done is we don't have memberships to use to sort of collect data like that, but we've run regular, if you can call them engagement units if you want, so inventory to authenticate and validate the audiences and their interests in a non-PPI manner. And that's worked for us. And we've been able to build, for lack of better terms, our own audience segments to use in targeting. But I'm always curious to hear what else is being used.
Well, that's actually, I think, a great kind of call to action between today and whenever Chrome finally pulls the trigger, comparing yesterday's analytics to tomorrow's analytics. Because today we can try alternative methods, and it's easy to compare to what we're doing in the third-party cookie-based world. So I think once everything's shut down, it will be much harder to go back in history and see how did it really work before. So that would be, I think, a good approach to it. Just split the budget, try it one way and the other way, and compare.
Yeah, the only thing I think about is what we're dealing with in iOS right now when we're doing user acquisition, where it's like the rule set, like you're kind of in a step beyond cookies where ATT has already been enacted, but fingerprinting may still be happening. So understanding, and that's been a really interesting part for our business, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel every day there's sort of a new solution out there, and this goes to the fragmentation you're talking about. I mean, to some degree, I'm very proud that Ogre, way before I joined this company, had thought about this and prepared for it and has been collecting our own proprietary data for so long. But that doesn't mean we don't have demand clients that are going to ask us to apply everybody else, right? And so this just full circle goes back to the ad tech tax and your mention of fragmentation. I mean, already there's a massive gap between the buy, industry wide, between the buy side rate versus when it makes its way, or sell side versus when it makes its way to the publisher. And the more elements, or middlemen as you want to call it, that we add to it, the larger the gap I think will grow, right? And so this is why we're very interested in hearing your opinion. So thank you for this. Go ahead, Mike. Yeah.
I was going to ask, do you think this significantly increases the value of the agency model? I think the agency model has historically been beaten up as like, inefficient or like tons of people. But the question is, like, in a world where you're going from one world to 6 to 10 with all new worlds of point solutions in there, and you're a media team or a marketing team, could you, like, what happens if you in-house that and you have a team of 20, and now if your team of 20 spends all day meeting with every company, you still don't have time? I mean,
Thank you for publicly.
right?
making
So
that
that's like
statement.
going to be positive for you guys.
I'm hoping we're still going to be valuable to marketers down the line. But no, that's a really good point. That's what we do. Our job is also evolving. What are we to a marketer? And it's not activating cheap scale on TV was not that long ago, but we're still responsible. At the end of the day, our job is to invest our clients' dollars as efficiently, effectively as possible. If this technology allows us to do that, we're doing our job. If this technology has an input cost, which is ad tech tax, that drives the ROI on the other side, then it's worth it. The delta that I invested to drive the value then becomes worthwhile. So this ad tech tax becomes very valuable to me because, again, in the end of the day, the mission is still the same.
And just to echo that, I mean, try this one. For the agency, I think if an agency is seeking fair and good tax and operating as a consultant, an educated consultant, absolutely, like extreme value there.
Yeah, I think. Sorry for the cards. I'll put these down now because it's more of a conversation. But I think, again, remember, I come supply side my whole career, right? And so where I find almost reassuring in what you've just mentioned is exactly that. You started off the panel talking about education, and hypothetically, before putting people in front of millions of dollars of budget, maybe have 3 years of experience understanding the industry and where you're buying and validating and all of that behind your belt makes sense to me. I mean, we've all worked with out of college graduates who are in charge with money I wish I had, right? And so it's one of those situations where, I mean, I think that's valid. I think the ad tech tax, again, just talking about it, there's so much in the middle that is we've said this word 1,000 times too, duplicative, right? Or everyone just wants their cut and they're providing nothing unique or bringing nothing new to the table, right? And so to focus then back on that, to go back on areas where there's necessity and I was going to curse, but let me not curse. But unnecessary ad tech tax, right? Where do you say? I mean, I would actually be very curious for each of you because we're all sort of different. Like, what have you found to be maybe unnecessary ad tech tax that you still have to play around in? You don't have to mention names of companies, but I'd be curious to know where you might find unnecessary spend right now. That's just part of something you're being forced to do. Yeah,
It's not necessarily forced to do. I'll go back to the educational piece. It's deduplication, unnecessary duplication of audiences. Still, I feel like is the most expensive thing that we end up paying for.
Can you, from my perspective, could you define what you mean by duplicative audiences? Is it is it reaching the same audience in multiple places?
Reaching the
Yeah.
same audience across multiple channels, not realizing it's the same people.
Same people. Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the verification and measurement space. Having that essentially counted twice on the buy and sell side is, in its nature, duplicative and unnecessary, really, and not helpful to the trust we should have in one another through the supply chain.
The one place I would call out that I'm not as tinfoil hat conspiracy is the DSP SSP relationship, if they're providing the value they're supposed to provide. So they're taking a big chunk of this tech tax. The DSP is meant to be the buyer on behalf of the advertiser, and the SSP is meant to be the agent of the publisher. SSPs have evolved to be more exchanges rather than providing services there. So, if there's a world where the DSP is doing what they're supposed to do and representing the demand, and SSP is doing what they're supposed to do and representing the supply's best interests, if that's at the same company and you can keep the user data separate, I think that's still kosher. I agree with the rest of the team, like paying twice for measurement and verification is very frustrating, but when it comes to those bigger chunks like on the SSP and DSP, if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's worth it.
That's actually a really good point. I will add to that, and again, this is just our industry for some reason decided that this is the right way to fund this, basically charging percentage of media. Well, all you're doing is basically ad serving. So for ad servers, we pay a flat CPM, but for DSP, we pay percentage of the media cost. It takes them just as much effort to deliver a $300 CPM campaign, which we do, and a 50-cent CPM campaign. But they make way more money on delivering a $300 CPM campaign. And I have not been able to get an explanation of why is that worth it, but that's, as an industry, we just set it up that way. Talk about that tech tax.
No, I mean, this is again very, very interesting. So I appreciate all of this background. I mean, I just keep finding myself thinking about the day-to-day conversations I have with publishers regarding this subject, right? Or just in general trends within the industry. And so, I mean, you were talking, Mike, about SSPs and DSPs and differences between the both of them, and sort of how SSPs maybe have evolved differently from what they used to be. But what I've noticed is an emergence of what I, for lack of better terms, call publisher managed service companies now, right? So this would be like Freestars of the world, or now, with Sovereign's acquisition of Proper Media, the Sovereign managed services. And do you feel, I'm sorry, Oleg, this might not be really a question for you, but do either of you feel that there's some duplicative nature between like an SSP and those platforms? Do you see them maybe combining? Like how do you view that in this space?
I think for me, it depends on the needs of the publisher and the resource that publisher has available. So if they need again, I keep saying the word trust. We all keep saying it, but like, if they trust the partner in that instance to operate correctly, fairly, and justify their tax, then yes, there's value there. But it needs to suit the publisher and their level of resource and level of competence.
I think they are somewhat competitive, but I think the Freestar Cafe Media model is interesting more so because it scales into the future more. It thinks about some of the data structures that you guys work with and thinks about applying them on almost a step more closed, like more towards a closed ecosystem. So in the future of cookies and device IDs, there's certain advantages, perhaps, that they may be able to explore certain privileges in that relationship. That could be a competitive advantage over a regular SSP.
Sorry, shockingly, I have an opinion on this too.
No, that's fine.
But it kind of goes back to what I said before about publisher being incentivized with what they end up seeing in the net effective CPM. If the value that these companies are providing to the publisher is enough for them to give back an impression to me that will hit my goals, then
then we're happy.
Then everybody's happy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it's a good ad tech text. Yeah.
I mean, I think we haven't said this word yet, but it fits directly with your comments on trust and distrust. But it's transparency, right? And so everyone's been talking about transparency and has meant different things for the last 10 years. Every conference I go to talks about transparency, right? But it's sort of, I've always felt like it's, and correct me if you feel otherwise, and we can sort of end on this point, but transparency for me has always been transparency to the advertiser, transparency to the publisher, not much transparency at going both directions, right? It's been a one-lane highway to one or the other, but never between the both, And so, I mean, what I've seen the industry try to do now is link up more transparency between the two, which is again removing middlemen. But is that not your view?
I think devil's always in the details. Transparency, yeah, clearly it's good. I look at transparency again more educational side because I also believe that there's value into putting skin in the game, in creating some kind of optimization platforms and charging for it what you think you're worth. And for that, you can take whatever whatever you think the value of your product is, and if it's hitting my goals, I will pay it. So, but as long as we're transparent about that, not full transparency, I think then the trust is there.
Anything, Alex or Mike, you would like to add or talk about regarding transparency?
Just I'd go a stage further than transparency and add meaning to it as well. So not just to identify what it is, but what it means is equally important.
I would say I have been encouraged by more conversations between publishers and advertisers in my career over the past 2 years. But prior to coming to the publisher side at WeatherBug, I was on the demand side at AOL. So I know how little the DSP and ad serving world on that side connects with the publisher world. Header bidding is such a big deal, not a lot of demand people know about it. Optimization algorithms, such a big deal, not a lot of supply people know about how they work. So there is a ton to have, and it's kind of on us and folks like Ogari for putting conversations like this together. Thank you. We need more of this in the future to create what's to come.
No, my pleasure. And so we are unfortunately out of time. I can talk about this all day, but I really appreciate you being here. This was a super informative panel. Thank you again for coming. Hopefully we do this again, but thank you, everybody. This was wonderful. Thanks. Bye.